Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a very special session with a very special person. Tim Geithner is, of course, the Secretary of Treasury of the United States. We're going to do this because it will be on television as well, in a slightly different format where we're going to have a conversation, then open it up to questions. So if you could just, for those of you who watch the Republican debates, hold your applause and your boos. So if he says something particularly controversial, don't boo. It's a great pleasure to have Timothy Geithner, the Secretary of the Treasury, on.
Nice to see you, Fareed.
Let me start with an easy question. What is the United States economy going to grow at this year?
You know, there are no oracles in economics, and it's still a pretty uncertain world. But I think the conventional view of the U.S. now is that we're growing between 2% and 3%. And I think that's a realistic outcome for the United States economy, as long as we see a little more progress in Europe, and as long as we don't see a lot of risk come from Iran on the oil front.
That scenario of 2 to 3% growth seems a little different from what Ben Bernanke thinks growth is going to look like. If you read the statement the Fed put out, it was a very bearish statement. I mean, to be willing to almost guarantee that rates will be kept where they are until the end of 2014 suggests they don't see any growth, of any robust growth for a long time. Are they wrong at the Fed?
Well, you know, I'm not a forecaster, so my view is not worth much. But I think actually if you look at both the Fed's forecast and the consensus of private forecasters in the business community among economists, people are pretty closely clustered in that area, but it's still very dependent on how the world unfolds. Again, I think it's worth recognizing that, you know, we still face tremendous challenges as a country. We're still repairing the damage caused by a devastating financial crisis that still has huge lasting impact on the basic fortunes of most Americans. Unemployment is still very high. Housing is still very, very weak. Construction is very weak. People still have too much debt. They're bringing that down, and that's still going to take a while to repair. That crisis came on top of a decade, as you know, where we saw virtually no growth in median income, very high levels of poverty in this country, very high levels of inequality, and a erosion in people's confidence in their mobility, their prospects go over time. And on top of that, of course, we face a more challenging world. You know, just last year, the combined effects of oil, Japan, and the crisis in Europe were, and the damage the debt limit debate caused the United States to confidence. Those things were very, very damaging, and they slowed growth everywhere around the world at a time when, again, the world was still healing. So we have a lot of challenges ahead in the United States, and we're working very hard to try to lay the foundation for the political consensus it's going to make progress in those things possible.
You know, there is a very well-established narrative now among the business community in the United States that there would be a much more robust recovery. The U.S. economy would be growing much more vigorously if there were greater certainty and businesses could invest. And the reason they're not is a kind of tsunami of regulations, uncertainty about tax policy, uncertainty about the deficit, but perhaps above all the sense that the economy is being thrown this huge new wave of regulations in healthcare and finance and energy, and that's what's keeping the economy back.
I don't think there's much basis for that view, although it is true that we are putting in place very tough reforms in the financial sector. We're trying to improve how the U.S. healthcare system works, and we're trying to change how Americans use energy. And those are necessary, desirable, very important long-term reforms to the United States. But I think if you look at the evidence we have about how the economy is doing and how the business community is doing in particular, the reality does not justify that sense. So just look at the things you can use to measure basic health, business health. You know, profitability across the American economy in the business is very, very high. Profits are higher than the pre-crisis peak. If you look at investment as a measure of confidence, private investment in equipment and software is up more than 30% since the trough in the first half of '09. Exports are up 23%. There's broad-based strength in energy, in agriculture, in manufacturing, not just high-tech manufacturing, but even heavy manufacturing. I was at a Siemens plant, new plant in the United States in North Carolina this week, which is building steam and gas turbines and generators and for export. And they're doing that because they see in the basic fundamentals of productivity in the United States, even with all our challenges, pretty compelling competitive advantage relative to where else they produce. So I think if you look at the basic health of the American business sector, it's much stronger than I think anybody would have thought at the peak of our crisis, and stronger than many of us hoped. What's holding the U.S. economy back still is the echoes, aftershocks of the financial crisis, the damage that's done to the household sector, to housing and construction, and the fiscal pressures on state and local governments in particular, which are a drag on growth globally. That combined with the shocks we saw globally is why growth has not been stronger than it has been. But I really don't think we could have realistically delivered a better outcome for the American business sector than has happened. And although we recognize that these reforms are tough and they're going to change the economics of business in this case, we think their overall effect on the economy is still going to be positive long term. And we think I don't think there's any basis for evidence that the impact of those things are hurting growth now. I'll just give you an example. The Heritage Foundation, which is a Republican think tank, one of the strongest critics of the impact of regulation so far, estimates the costs could be $20 billion over time. That's a dramatic exaggeration of the potential costs. But remember, we're a $14 trillion economy. And I think on the evidence we have, profitability, what the markets think about future profit growth, and how companies are behaving, I don't think there's any merit to that argument.
While business profitability is up, productivity is up, unemployment still remains a huge challenge, and many businesses have become more productive because they've taken costs out of the system, they've managed very efficiently. How do you get the American jobs machine going again?
Well, the biggest driver of how fast the unemployment rate comes down is how fast we grow. And the biggest determinant of how fast we grow now is really going to depend on these two fundamental factors. One is what happens in the world, meaning in Europe and in the Gulf, and because of oil. And frankly, just to be direct about it, whether Republicans in Congress decide they want to legislate things that are good for growth in the short term. So what we think the right economic agenda for the country is for us to legislate a set of investment incentives, investments in things that matter for long-term growth, rebuilding America's infrastructure, more education, more spending on innovation, basic science and research, better skills for Americans, tied to long-term fiscal reforms that restore sustainability. And if we were able to legislate progress on those things in the short term, that would make a big difference for confidence. It would make a difference for this rate of growth of the American economy in the short run. But to be realistic, it's going to take a long time still for us to fully repair the damage, particularly unemployment that came as a cause of the crisis. But the private sector's created 3.2 million jobs since job growth resumed. That's actually pretty strong job growth in the private sector compared to the last two recoveries. And it's pretty strong given the aftershocks of the crisis. We all want it to be stronger, though. But the fundamental reality is how fast we grow is going to depend on those two factors. Is Europe successful in stabilizing the crisis in Europe? And can we help build the political foundation in the United States for the type of pro-growth investments tied to long-term fiscal reforms that are the obvious imperative for our future?
You negotiated with the Republicans. Do you think there's any chance that they would pass some of the things the president talked about in the State of the Union?
I think you have to wait and see. I think they're talking a little bit about infrastructure now for the first time. They've said they're going to pass this payroll tax cut, of course, which has a positive but modest impact on income, which is important. We feel like there's a compelling case for a targeted set of investment incentives that would be good for improving the economics of investing and building the United States. Those things have not typically been partisan issues. They've had very broad support among Republicans in the past. And, our view is there's nothing standing in the way of progress on those things, even if it's going to take some time to work out the bigger fights on tax reform and entitlements. But that's a calculation they have to make.
Most people who look at the American tax code, which is with regulations and rules, 10,000 pages, one of the most complicated in the world, believe that the key to reforming the tax code is broaden the base, eliminate deductions and loopholes, lower rates. Isn't the president's proposal in the State of the Union taking us in exactly the opposite direction?
Not at all. In fact, I don't think you're going to see, well, let me do it differently. The president's proposals, which are focused on a set of investment favorable reforms in the corporate tax system, manufacturing and investment, and on a modest but necessary increase in the effective tax rate paid by the richest Americans, those two things are only going to come, I think, realistically, in the context of broad reform. And what we're trying to do is lay the foundation for tax reform so that we can produce a more simple system, lower rates, broader base, more simple, less distortions.
Why not just propose tax reform?
Well, and because I think you have to start with principles for a framework, and what we're trying to do is to be specific which areas we think should dominate the debate. So, again, I wish it were different for us, but the basic crude fiscal realities of the United States now, and we have to recognize we have to govern within those limits, means that when we do tax reform, we're going to have to be helping contribute to deficit reduction. We don't have the ability to offer the American people or the American business people community a net tax cut. That is beyond the capacity of anybody realistic about our constraints. It is also true that fundamental to any resolution of those long-term fiscal problems is going to have to be a modest increase in the effective tax rate, again, of the richest Americans. And the balance of pain and adjustment and burden that's going to have to come is going to come with those tax reforms on individuals combined with some pretty substantial changes in the trajectory of growth and benefits that will affect many middle-class Americans. Realistically, that's what's going to come over time, but it's not going to come without figuring out how to change that basic constraint Republicans have put on the American economic policy debate. And I think if you listen carefully, it's starting to change. If you look at polls are not very reliable in economic policy as a guide to economic policy, but majority of Republicans now, majority of independents, very strong majorities, support a long-term fiscal reform package that has as part of it an increase in the effective tax rate for the richest Americans. That helps a lot. And if you listen carefully, you're seeing Democrats show more pragmatism and realism and creativity in recognizing that our long-term entitlement commitments are unsustainable, and you're going to need both. But again, to be realistic, we're going to have a big debate on those basic choices, and it's unlikely we're going to make significant progress on those things ahead of the election. Those problems aren't going to go away. And at the end of this year in the United States, you know that the expiry of a bunch of tax cuts and the impact of an automatic cuts in spending are going to be a big motivator to trying to make progress on the fiscal front going forward. But again, just to put in perspective, our fiscal problems are daunting for us in the long run, but they are much more manageable problems than faced by almost any major economy around the world. And it's important not to lose sight of the fact that given the high level of unemployment, given the very bad outcomes for median income in the United States over the last 30 years, 20 years, 10 years, given the just appallingly high rates of poverty in the United States, given the competitive challenges we face, it's going to require pretty significant investments in infrastructure and education, innovation. You have to take a much broader approach. And we're not going to solve our problems as a country by thinking they're centrally about how we restore fiscal sustainability. That's part of it. But